It is a good time to be a filmmaker, at least when it comes to camera options. There's so many new cameras every single year, it's honestly kind of hard to keep track of all of them. And that's only half the story. For every new camera that smashes into the market, older ones slowly drift away a little bit. It's inevitable as technology gets better. The industry standards of yesteryear are packed away into boxes and left in our attics. As they age, they lose more and more value and they're sold off for a fraction of their original cost. But that isn't a bad thing. There are incredible cameras that shoot beautiful images that cost basically nothing, and once you pair them with a skilled filmmaker, you can stand toe-to-toe with today's shiny new cinema cameras without needing to stomach the price tag. But this is where research comes in. You don't just trip over a gold bar on an afternoon walk. You have to learn how to pan first. And lucky for you, this is how I spend most of my free time, and I found something really special. This camera has shot thousands of projects over the years, and not just a sprinkle of passion projects either. I'm talking high-end streaming IPs and theatrical releases. For a camera to reach that level of adoption, it would need to shoot beautiful images. It needs to be reliable, and it needs to have the right I/O to make production possible. When you add all these things together, we're often spending hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars a day just to rent one of these things, but that isn't the case here. You can find this camera used for around $3,000 for a full kit, and sometimes even less, which is cheaper than most professional mirrorless cameras these days. And what you get for $3,000 in this camera is truly ridiculous. We'll talk about image quality in a second because there's a lot to unpack there. Let's begin with physical design, and we'll start at a high level. The Panasonic Varicam LT weighs in at about 6 pounds without any peripherals attached, and with a bit of rigging, we're probably looking at 10 to 15 pounds. If you ask me, this is the Goldilocks weight for a proper cinecam. With its stainless steel lens mount and magnesium body, it feels like an absolute tank, and I can totally see why this camera has a reputation for being bulletproof. Handheld shots will look nice and stable since there's enough weight to smooth out micro jitter, but it still isn't unmanageable. If you need to hold one for hours, an easy rig will save your back, but otherwise, it isn't bad at all. Buying support to carry this much weight used to be really expensive, and it still kind of is, but the market is saturated enough that there are at least a few options that are affordable. Instead of spending thousands of dollars on only a tripod head, you can pick up sticks and a tripod head that's rated to carry this much weight for $500, maybe less. Sure, you won't be able to fly it on most gimbals, but we're going to be using dollies and sliders anyway. And if you absolutely need a gimbal shot for some reason, then rent a B cam that would match pretty well. Like I think the Panasonic S1H would do a great job. One of the reasons you buy cinema cameras like this is for its selection of I/O, and the Varicam doesn't disappoint. 2 3G SDI on the back and 1 on the front for the viewfinder, 1 5-pin XLR, 2 3-pin XLR for audio plus a headphone out, 1 pin XLR for power, 1 4-pin XLR out for power, 10-pin RCU for control, USB Type-B, BNC timecode in, USB-A, 20-pin control for the monitor, 6-pin GPS, BNC Genlock in, an RJ45, and a 12-pin lens control. You feel pretty cool rolling up with this thing when your friends only have a single micro HDMI. On the back, we're looking at a gold mount plate here. This might also be a V-mount plate if you buy one used because you can swap them. It's worth keeping in mind that B&H rates this camera's power draw at less than 77 watts, so it's pretty power hungry. As for media, we arrive at some bad news. The Varicam LT records to Panasonic P2 cards, which are either extremely expensive, if even available, or floating around on the used market for much cheaper. If you're wanting to pick up one of these used, I would look for one that includes a few of these. You'll also need a card reader, but those are pretty cheap, so don't worry too much there. In case you're wondering what this other slot is, it's for SD cards in case you want to record proxies. Then we get to the stainless steel lens mount. Separate from its older brother, the Varicam 35, which came standard with a PL mount, the Varicam LT comes standard with a positive lock EF mount, but is swappable to PL. The best of both worlds, if you ask me. The Varicam gets another big gold star for including internal NDs. Here we get 2-stop, 4-stop, and 6-stop reductions. There does seem to be some pretty significant IR pollution on the sensor and ND system, so keep that in mind. You'll probably need to add an IR cut to your filter stack. Now let's move on to operation. If you've never used a cinema camera before, it might seem intimidating, but trust me, it is not that bad. A lot of cameras that are designed specifically for cinema have really simple and logical menu setup, so let's run through this one really quick. I actually really like this UI, it's very airy. You get to it by hitting home, you have all your basic settings that you can hit with these little keys right here, and then you can go back home if you want. You have ISO, resolutions, white balance, shutter color, and FPS. The cool thing about the Varicam LT is that you can hit view and this becomes a monitor. A lot of these other cameras, you can't really do that. They're just for settings. So we'll go back home. Like I said, if you hit any of these, you can go in here and use this jog wheel to go in and change things. It's very solid and satisfying. Then you also have this menu button. System settings, this is all of the things that you can change that have to do with well, the system. So you can come in here, you can change the color settings, where LUTs are being sent to, where they are not being sent to. System mode is where you can change your frequency and your codec, that kind of stuff. Playback settings, cards and media, this is where you would format. You can change the fan speed, all this kind of stuff. Information, clock. Then there's the camera settings, which will allow you to fine tune some of the image quality related things. You can do some white balance stuff, auto black balance, noise reduction, shutter, lens settings, that kind of thing. Record settings, this is where you can change your file names, record beep sound apparently, watermarks, all kinds of things that have to do with the recording itself. You got audio settings in here. Output settings. This is where you can put all your markers on, your focus assist, stuff like that, and you can tell it where to send it and where not to send it. You got file for scene files and setup files, and those are loaded through the SD card. And you got peripheral, which is GPS, network, stuff like that. So yeah, it's actually very simple. You come in here one time, you set up everything exactly the way you want it, and then you hit home while you're operating. If you have an external display or a viewfinder, you can just keep it on this screen. Everything is right in front of you. You can see how much time you have left on a card. You can see your time code. You can see your battery and all your settings. If you want and you don't have an external display, you can hit view and use this as an actual monitor. It still displays all of your settings down here. It even shows what kind of ND you're at, or you can just come back here to home and look at that. There's even a nice big record button right here. Let's move on to the sensor. This is a Super 35 CMOS sensor with an effective area of 8.9 megapixels, a maximum resolution of DCI 4K, and dual native ISOs at 800 and 5000. I could be wrong, but I think this is one of the first cameras to ever implement 2 native ISOs. The Varicam LT was released all the way back in 2016, so you would expect the image quality to start to show its age at this point, but we do have to remember its original price tag was $18,000, and the Alexa Classic is 6 years older than it and still has one of the best images in filmmaking, so age isn't everything, especially when it comes to the high-end models. Let's start with readout speed. I did some digging and couldn't find any really concrete numbers, but some say at worst the Varicam LT takes about 15 milliseconds to read out, which isn't bad at all. And I didn't see any rolling shutter artifacts in any of my footage, so I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. Let's move on to dynamic range. Now on this channel, I'm usually referencing Cinedy's dynamic range charts, but for the first time ever, they do not have a chart for this camera. So we're all on our own, but that's totally fine. We'll still do a latitude test, and we're gonna compare it to my Broadcast G2, which now that I think about it, they're actually pretty similar cameras. So what I've done here is turned false color on the Varicam, which it does have internally. I've exposed this 18% gray card for middle gray, and then I will either stop the lens down or up so we can push or pull in either direction and see what we can get back. So let's do shadow recovery first. This is 0, you can tell because there's a 0. We'll go to 1 stop, it looks pretty good. 2 stops, looking good. I'm seeing a little bit of texture on the wall here, but this noise pattern isn't bad. 3 stops down, starting to see some noise. Doesn't look too bad. It's not clumpy, it's not digital and weird looking. Should be able to denoise it pretty good, but I think this is a usable result. We're already at 3, 4, okay, so this is a significant amount of noise. Let's see if we can process this and get something usable out of it. What I'm gonna do is add a noise reduction layer before the very first thing in the node tree. So sometimes I like to come in here and the first thing I'll try is ultra noise reduction, which is a brand new thing for DaVinci Resolve 19. Sometimes it's like magic and sometimes it's not that great. So I usually just try this first just to see what happens. And it has done some really aggressive noise reduction here. And it's also slowing my computer down a whole bunch. Let's see if we can get a better result manually. We're losing some detail and like my hair's looking a little bit more reddish because there's so much warm reddish noise that's contaminating the color. I think I would call this usable though. That's 4 stops under. It's pretty impressive. There's absolutely no shot that 5 is gonna work. So we'll cap it at 4, which is a really good result. That's impressive. Let's go to overexposure. There we are at 0, looking good. 1 looks good, 2 over looks good. 3 over looks good. 4 over looks good. Gerard's face is blown out now. So I'm probably next. And there it is at 5. We will cap that at 4. So that's 8 entire stops of exposure latitude, which is really, really, really impressive. That's a great result even by today's standards. And really quick, I'm gonna compare it to every other camera that I currently have in the studio. The first one is the old reliable Broadcast G2. We'll run through this super fast. Also, this is worth mentioning, this is in Apple ProRes in 4K. This is not in RAW. I wanted to match the codec to be somewhat similar to what the Varicam is shooting in. There would be highlight recovery if we were recording in RAW, but we are not. So we'll cap it at 3. Let's go to shadow. There's 0, 1, 2, 3, still looking great. 4 is looking great. 5 is where I capped it as unusable last time. I don't know if my contrast ratios are different this time, but I think we might be able to get this to work. Some quick noise reduction, and I can tell you right now, that's gonna go ahead and be usable. Got some weirdness in here. You could be more careful with the noise reduction, but we'll call that usable. 6, I really doubt it, but we'll try. Wow, yeah, my hair's black. Yeah, we'll cap that there. Whoa. 3 and 5, that's also 8 stops of latitude, and this is a pretty high performing sensor. Here's a really exciting one. This is an Arri Alexa Classic, obviously looking great at 0 stops, 1 looking good, 2 looks good, 3, 4, 5 looks good. Gerard's starting to lose a little bit of detail there. We are losing detail at 6, but it's reaching all the way up to 5 stops, and the roll-off is looking a little bit better than the other cameras. 5 over, I don't expect it to do as good in shadows. 1 looks fine, 2 looks fine, 3 looks fine. We're starting to shift a little bit green. There's quite a bit of noise here, but this noise pattern is just beautiful. I would call this usable because I know it's gonna denoise great, but let's see if we can get 6 to work. You might be able to really push it and get this to work, but I'm gonna go ahead and say no. So we'll say 3. So we're at 8.5, maybe even wiggle room towards 9 with the Alexa. The last camera that I have access to right now is an FX30, which we can go ahead and add into the mix really quick. Peaking at 4 stops over, so we'll say 3. Somewhere between 4 and 5 is where I think it's going to be unusable. It also loses a lot of contrast and color information and shadows as you go down. It is a compressed codec, so it makes sense. I think 5's definitely not usable. You might be able to get 4 to work. Yeah, you could get 4 to work. I'll need a little bit of contrast. Yeah, I'll take that for sure. I haven't tested any other cameras except for the C400, which is somewhere between 6.5, 7, maybe 7.5 stops of exposure latitude in my setup. Your miles may vary depending on what kind of levels of noise you're comfortable with and what your setup is and what the shot is and how much contrast is in the shot and all of those things. The point is, the Varicam scoring 8 stops of latitude, matching the Ursa Broadcast G2, and being pretty close to the Arri Alexa Classic is really impressive, especially for a camera that old. Color science is another pretty hot topic amongst filmmakers these days, and Panasonic is a weird one when it comes to this, because when the Varicam LT first came out, it was known for having a beautiful, creamy, smooth look to it, but also a lot of us have a bad taste in our mouths from the GH5 days. So when you look at the community of filmmakers, everybody has a different opinion when it comes to Panasonic color. Like I always say, I think it's perfectly doable to get a beautiful image out of basically any camera these days. But if you're curious what the color looks like right out of camera, we're going to compare it to the Broadcast G2, an FX30, and an Arri Alexa. I've just grabbed 4 talking headshots from these 4 different cameras, and there are no adjustments on here besides CSTs. I will even show you to prove it. CST right here going from V-gamut to intermediate, and then from intermediate into Rec 709, and all of these are the same. There are some adjustments on here that I have turned off. We'll get to those in a second. So first of all, the Varicam looks great, as you would expect right out of camera. There's nothing but a CST going on. I think that the skin tones look really good. Nothing looks weird. This is a great starting point. We'll pop over to the FX30 to compare it to first, and what you'll notice right away is it looks like there's a white balance difference. When I filmed these, they all had the exact same settings, exact same white balance, same settings, same lens set to the same aperture, all of these things. So they should match perfectly. These are just differences in color interpretation. And there's a little bit more yellow and green, it's looking like, in the background specifically of the FX30 shot, but I think it's more so the Varicam that's the outlier, because when we go to all these other ones, these all look pretty similar amongst each other. The Varicam is the one that's a little bit different. I don't think it's necessarily bad. It would be incredibly easy to fix this or not to fix it if that's the look you're going for. This is the Alexa. Alexa's doing a really, really good job of getting a healthy, warm skin tone, but still getting this color separation. The rest of the background is a little bit more green, a little bit cooler. We'll compare between the two. And yeah, the Alexa is just picking up more color separation. Again, we can correct these to look pretty similar. And last but not least is the Blackmagic. Blackmagic is looking pretty similar to these other three. Doesn't quite have the color separation that the Alexa does, but it still obviously looks great. I'm always talking about how you should learn how to work in a color grading suite and then develop the skill so that you can use almost any camera today and make them all look great. I really do believe that that is a useful skill. So I've taken these 4 shots and I've matched them. The way that I've matched them is with a new technique that I've been loving recently. So for example, in this Varicam shot, maybe I would want a little bit more of that yellow green shift. Maybe I want to get a little bit away from the cooler tones. Usually people gravitate towards the primaries and they'll just use this slider. And this can definitely work. I don't know about you guys, but it feels not always super accurate and I have to play with it a lot and there's a little bit of trial and error there. My new favorite way to color correct or do white balance corrections is to right click a node that's in my timeline working color space, which is between these two. Right click it, change the gamma to linear, and then go to primaries, and now your gain will organically shift colors around globally. So I'm gonna look at my vector scope, and we wanna move down here a little bit. More yellow, more green, maybe a little bit more cyan. We wanna move away from red and magenta just a little bit. So I'm gonna get rid of clip so I can see, and I'll drag down in that direction just a little bit. And then we'll look at before and after. So much better than if you just had a regular primary and you were working in your timeline space and you did offset. It can kind of shift stuff around in a way that's not always very useful. So what I've done is I've gone and corrected all of these clips. So here's the Alexa shot, and I've tried my best to match everything to the Alexa. I've used its image as my North Star. The only thing that I've done is adjusted the contrast, and I've done some color correction, but only with that linear trick that I just showed you guys. So there's the Alexa. There's the FX30. I mean, it's pretty close. Blackmagic. Maybe I could go a little bit more green on the Blackmagic. And there's the Varicam. So there's the before and after of that adjustment on the Varicam. I think it looks a lot better. So, I mean, this took 2 minutes to match all of these. In summary, I think that the colors coming out of the Varicam look awesome. And even if they didn't look perfect, I think that it's not the end of the world if you bring your footage into your NLE, you put a LUT or a CST on the footage and it doesn't look absolutely perfect. You're supposed to be in a color grading suite pushing and pulling things around with cameras like this. They're designed for that. Our last image related category is sensitivity in low light scenarios. Because it has a dual native ISO, one at 800 and one at 5000, you'd expect it to have a little bit more reach, but we're gonna go ahead and test it and compare it again to the Broadcast G2 because it also has dual native ISOs. The Varicam LT is an absolute legend. You get a great selection of resolutions and frame rates, the colors are beautiful, there's impressive dynamic range, a fantastic form factor, tons of I/O for whatever projects call for, and you can pick one up for less than the price of an R5C, an FX3, or maybe even a Pixis. If I was just starting out and I wanted to find work as an owner-operator, there's a really good chance I would pick up one of these. Instead of going to buy a Komodo X and some Canon RF lenses and immediately blowing past that 10K mark, I'd buy one of these, I'd carefully pick out some prime lenses, I would spend money on grip and lighting and audio, and you would still have money left over for other things. The only thing I can think of that competes at a similar price point would be a used Ursa Broadcast G2 or a used Ursa 4.6K G2, and that's some pretty good company to be in. I am absolutely blown away by this camera, and I think it's really, really impressive, and all for the price of a DSM-C3 monitor. Hey, thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.